The dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight is a story that begins not in the bustling streets or grand avenues of the German capital, but in the shadow of fear and desperation that had seized the city as the Third Reich crumbled. By April 1945, Berlin had become a cauldron of anxiety, where the thrum of artillery and the distant roar of tanks were inseparable from the cries of its inhabitants. Families huddled in cellars and basements, the once familiar cityscape reduced to shattered facades and scorched streets, unsure if they would survive the next day, or the next hour. Yet, amid this chaos, a far more insidious threat emerged. Civilians, men, women, and even children, were being executed with ruthless efficiency, often for the smallest perceived act of defiance, suspicion, or merely for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Understanding the dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight requires looking beyond the immediate violence to the political and military anxieties driving it. Orders flowed down from desperate commanders who feared betrayal, feared espionage, feared the collapse of discipline, and feared the moral reckoning that awaited them. Meanwhile, the Red Army advanced relentlessly, bringing both liberation and retribution, a duality that blurred the lines between combatant and civilian. Eyewitness testimonies and diaries reveal the psychological torment of those caught between a regime in collapse and an army bent on vengeance, painting a vivid picture of terror that was both systemic and deeply personal. As the story unfolds, it becomes clear that the executions were not random, but part of a calculated mechanism of control, fear, and revenge, a mechanism that forced ordinary Berliners into impossible choices and left scars that would linger long after the guns fell silent. By the spring of 1945, Berlin had become an unrecognizable landscape, a city scarred by relentless bombardment and internal collapse. Streets that once echoed with the rhythm of daily life were now littered with rubble, twisted metal, and the remnants of homes reduced to ash. Entire neighborhoods had vanished beneath the weight of Allied bombs, and the iconic landmarks that had long symbolized the capital's grandeur, such as the Brandenburg Gate and the Reichstag, stood as hollowed-out reminders of a civilization under siege. Bridges that once connected districts were broken spans of concrete, and rail lines, once the veins of transportation, had been twisted and scorched beyond use. In this physical destruction lay the first layer of the city's unraveling, a tangible manifestation of vulnerability and chaos that affected both the environment and the people who had once thrived within it. The social fabric of Berlin had frayed with equal intensity. Families were displaced, often forced to crowd into cellars, bunkers, or surviving apartment blocks that could barely accommodate them. Children wandered through streets strewn with detritus, sometimes in shock, sometimes carrying the unbearable responsibility of scavenging for food or water for younger siblings. The elderly, many immobilized by infirmity, faced the terrifying prospect of survival in a city where medical care had become sporadic and pharmacies were stripped bare. Daily life, once predictable and structured, had dissolved into a cycle of fear, hunger, and uncertainty. People who had relied on routines, employment, and neighborhood networks now found themselves isolated, often unable to distinguish friend from foe, civilian from soldier. The psychological toll was immense. Rumors of executions, street fighting, and indiscriminate killings spread like wildfire, stoking a pervasive paranoia that heightened every encounter and eroded trust among neighbors. In this environment, even minor acts, venturing into a damaged street, seeking food from a suspicious source, or failing to comply immediately with an authority figure, could be perceived as a threat, setting the stage for tragic consequences. Desperation manifested itself in behaviors that would have been unthinkable months earlier. People scavenged through wreckage for scraps of food or usable materials, sometimes fighting over what little remained. Markets no longer existed in the organized sense. Bartering and theft became survival mechanisms. Civilian populations had grown accustomed to the omnipresence of propaganda, which had intensified under the strain of defeat. Radio broadcasts, leaflets, and posters conveyed an urgent mixture of defiance and doom, warning that any form of surrender or contact with the enemy was treason. The regime's propaganda machine sought to manipulate fear, portraying the approaching Soviet forces as monstrous invaders who would exact vengeance on every citizen who faltered. Such messaging only amplified existing anxieties, creating an environment in which civilians were both victims and instruments of psychological warfare, conditioned to see threats at every turn. It is in this context of compounded fear, physical destruction, scarcity, rumor, and propaganda, that the city teetered on the edge of total collapse. The infrastructural devastation of Berlin contributed directly to the peril of civilians. Water mains were broken, leaving entire districts without drinking water. Electricity was intermittent at best, plunging neighborhoods into darkness at night and exposing people to the constant threat of armed patrols or artillery fire. Hospitals were overcrowded and undersupplied. Medical personnel struggled to treat wounds that ranged from shrapnel injuries to burns, often improvising with whatever materials were on hand. Sanitation had broken down in many quarters, increasing the risk of disease. These conditions compounded the psychological strain, making the population more susceptible to panic and more likely to misjudge danger. In such a fragile environment, rumors of enemy presence or internal betrayal were enough to spark mass hysteria, and the military authorities, both German and Allied, were acutely aware of how easily fear could escalate into chaos. Consequently, extreme measures against civilians, while horrific, were rationalized within this climate of suspicion and desperation. Propaganda and the collapse of civil order were interwoven, reinforcing a feedback loop of fear. Nazi authorities, aware that morale was deteriorating, intensified their efforts to maintain control through threats and displays of lethal force. Posters and public announcements warned that any acts of resistance or failure to follow orders would be punished with death, and anecdotal reports of public executions circulated widely, even beyond the neighborhoods where they occurred. For the average Berliner, the lines between rumor and reality blurred, creating an omnipresent anxiety that pervaded every decision. It was within this climate that the notion of civilians being expendable gained traction among some military units, as fear of betrayal or collaboration justified the harshest punitive measures. Civilians, whether actively resisting or merely perceived as a threat, became targets in a psychological and military calculus that prioritized obedience and fear over the preservation of life. The advancing Red Army intensified these pressures. From the east, the Soviet forces moved with relentless momentum, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Berliners had heard stories from escaping refugees, tales of massacres, looting, and reprisals that spread terror faster than any official communique. Even for those who had never left the city, the sounds of artillery, tanks, and gunfire created a tangible sense of the city closing in on itself. Soldiers and civilians alike navigated a landscape where danger was constant and unpredictable. The German military command, recognizing the inevitability of defeat, resorted to draconian measures to maintain a semblance of order, issuing instructions that, in effect, sanctioned violence against anyone suspected of disloyalty. In a city under siege, where every sound, shadow, and movement could signal threat, these measures blurred moral and legal boundaries, transforming ordinary streets into lethal zones where survival depended as much on luck as on judgment. Even within families and neighborhoods, the stress of daily life eroded traditional social bonds. Neighbors suspected one another of collaboration or theft. Siblings and children quarreled over scarce rations. Adults debated whether to flee, hide, or comply with authority. Fear became the common denominator, binding the population together, and yet isolating individuals in ways that made communal decision-making nearly impossible. This social fragmentation amplified the dangers posed by military enforcement, as authorities could act with impunity, confident that civilian solidarity was unlikely to impede their operations. In this sense, the collapse of the city was not merely physical but profoundly social, a breakdown that created fertile ground for both chaos and cruelty. By examining Berlin on the brink, it becomes evident that the city's destruction was both visible and psychological. The ruins of buildings and bridges marked the tangible cost of war, while hunger, fear, and propaganda ensured that the collapse extended deep into the human psyche. Civilians were trapped between external violence and internal anxiety, navigating streets that were at once familiar and alien, forced to reconcile survival instincts with moral imperatives that were impossible to fulfill. In this environment, the eventual targeting of civilians by military forces emerges not as a mere byproduct of combat, but as a grim consequence of a city pushed to the limits of endurance. The interplay of physical devastation, social disintegration, and psychological terror created a volatile ecosystem where the laws of normal human behavior were suspended, and where extreme measures, execution on sight, became a horrifyingly rationalized response to the imminent collapse. The story of Berlin at this juncture is therefore more than a chronicle of bombed-out streets or collapsed infrastructure. It is a study of the human condition under relentless pressure. It illustrates how fear, desperation, and propaganda can transform a population from citizens into potential threats in the eyes of military authorities. By understanding these dynamics, one begins to see why, in a city on the brink, extreme measures against civilians were not only possible but, in the distorted logic of wartime hysteria, almost inevitable. This insight sets the stage for exploring the dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight, revealing how ideology, panic, and tactical considerations converged in a lethal calculus that left ordinary people at the mercy of forces beyond their comprehension. As Berlin teetered on the edge of annihilation, the decisions shaping life and death within its boundaries were increasingly dictated by orders that came from far beyond the shattered streets. The city, already crippled by destruction and fear, became a testing ground for the ruthless calculus of military and political authority. For both the remnants of the Wehrmacht and the advancing Soviet forces, controlling behavior in the city was as much about ideology and vengeance as it was about conventional military strategy. The issuance of shoot-on-sight directives, while horrifying in practice, was part of a broader logic that sought to eliminate perceived threats before they could manifest, and to instill absolute obedience through fear. To comprehend the dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight, one must first trace how these orders were conceived, formalized, and operationalized, revealing a chilling interplay of desperation, ideology, and bureaucratic rigor. In the final months of the Third Reich, Hitler's command structure had become both centralized and erratic. As his military advisors warned of inevitable defeat, directives increasingly emphasized punishment and deterrence over strategic retreat. German commanders, seeking to maintain discipline among troops and civilians alike, often issued orders that blurred the line between military necessity and ideological vengeance. Documents recovered from the German High Command archives reveal memoranda stressing the need to enforce loyalty at all costs, framing any civilian act that could be interpreted as collaboration with advancing Soviet forces as a capital offense. In practice, this meant that men and women wandering the streets, scavenging for supplies, or even attempting to communicate with soldiers could be treated as legitimate targets. These policies were not merely reactive. They were anticipatory, designed to preempt acts of resistance or treachery by establishing an omnipresent climate of threat. Within such a framework, survival was contingent not only on one's own judgment but on adherence to a rigid set of rules whose violation, even unintentionally, could result in immediate execution. The logic behind these extreme measures was further reinforced by the psychological state of German commanders, many of whom were acutely aware of the impending collapse. Fear of betrayal, coupled with long-standing indoctrination in the principles of National Socialism, led to an environment in which civilians were perceived less as non-combatants and more as potential saboteurs or informants. Reports circulated within the Wehrmacht detailing instances where local populations allegedly aided advancing forces, sometimes exaggerating the prevalence of collaboration to justify harsher enforcement measures. Officers were instructed to maintain control through exemplary punishment, creating an atmosphere in which even unverified suspicion could trigger lethal action. Intercepted communications from the time show a recurring theme: the need to preserve order at all costs, to prevent weakness from spreading, and to ensure that ideological purity was maintained even in the face of impending defeat. Civilians became an expendable variable in a broader strategy of survival, where discipline and fear outweighed humanity. On the other side of the battlefield, Soviet commanders faced a different but equally chilling set of imperatives. The Red Army's approach to Berlin was informed not only by military necessity, but also by years of ideological and personal resentment toward Nazi Germany. Orders captured in post-war archives demonstrate a systematic prioritization of deterrence and retribution. The concept of shoot on sight was formalized in a series of directives intended to punish collaborators, preempt sabotage, and intimidate the remaining population into compliance. Historical analysis of Soviet communications indicates that these measures were rationalized both tactically and psychologically. Swift, public executions were believed to prevent disorder and signal the consequences of resistance, while also serving as instruments of revenge for the immense suffering inflicted upon Soviet civilians during the invasion. Ideology, memory, and strategy were inseparable, creating a calculus in which civilians became proxies for the broader German state and, by extension, valid targets within the logic of military justice as interpreted by the Soviet command. The mechanisms through which these orders were implemented were astonishingly systematic. Wehrmacht units and Soviet detachments alike relied on a network of reports, checkpoints, and patrols to identify targets. In Berlin, soldiers were often briefed each morning with updated intelligence, photographs, or lists of individuals deemed suspicious. Civilians caught outside designated areas, failing to respond immediately to commands, or found near strategic installations were at extreme risk. Archival documents reveal that these policies were formalized with meticulous attention to procedure. Execution teams were assigned specific sectors, timing, and even methods to ensure efficiency, reflecting a bureaucratic discipline overlaid upon violence. The combination of ideology, fear, and organizational structure created an environment in which murder could be treated as both a tactical necessity and a bureaucratic routine, leaving civilians with virtually no safe space. Analysis of memos, orders, and personal diaries reveals the dual rationale guiding such actions: deterrence and retaliation. Deterrence required demonstrating that any deviation from compliance, any hint of collaboration, would be met with the harshest consequence. Retaliation was motivated by revenge, both for individual acts of defiance and for the broader historical wounds inflicted by the war. In practice, these two objectives often merged. A civilian accused of minor infractions could become the focus of public execution, simultaneously serving as a warning to neighbors and as a symbolic act of vengeance. Letters from Wehrmacht officers to higher command illustrate this convergence, emphasizing that maintaining authority often required decisive and uncompromising measures, while reports from Soviet commanders similarly note the dual objectives of instilling fear and avenging prior atrocities committed against Soviet territory and civilians. The ideological dimension of these decisions cannot be understated. For the Germans, long-standing Nazi propaganda had dehumanized both internal and external populations, portraying enemies and potential traitors as less than human, deserving of elimination. Civilians in Berlin, therefore, were not merely residents of a city under siege. They were part of a system that framed obedience as the ultimate moral imperative and deviation as inherently treasonous. For the Soviets, decades of propaganda and personal experience of wartime devastation cultivated a lens of suspicion and hatred, framing German civilians collectively as bearers of culpability for the suffering of occupied territories. Orders issued by both sides reflect the convergence of ideology and military necessity, producing a lethal framework in which human life was subordinated to abstract objectives of control, retribution, and deterrence. Beyond formal directives, the enforcement of these orders depended heavily on the interpretation of junior officers and patrol units. While the central commands provided guidance, much of the violence occurred in a decentralized, improvisational manner, where the stress of urban combat and the scarcity of reliable intelligence amplified the likelihood of indiscriminate action. Soldiers operating under fear for their own survival often acted preemptively, erring on the side of extreme measures. Field reports and survivor accounts from Berlin describe soldiers rounding up civilians for questioning, interrogating them in makeshift facilities, and executing them on the spot if suspicion could not be immediately dismissed. In this way, formal orders merged seamlessly with local initiative, creating a pervasive culture in which civilians were continuously vulnerable to arbitrary violence. The use of communication networks and intelligence also played a critical role. Intercepted radio transmissions and internal communiques reveal that both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army maintained detailed surveillance operations, constantly monitoring civilian movement, gathering reports of alleged collaboration, and disseminating instructions to field units. This constant flow of information reinforced the execution policies, ensuring that shoot-on-sight orders were not merely abstract edicts but operational directives embedded in the daily routines of military personnel. It also contributed to a feedback loop. As reports of civilian punishment were filed and circulated, higher command often responded with further tightening of rules, creating a self-perpetuating cycle in which fear justified more extreme enforcement, which in turn amplified civilian terror. Ultimately, the dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight emerges from this complex interplay of top-down command, ideological indoctrination, and operational pragmatism. Military and political authorities, confronted with an existential crisis, formalized policies that treated civilians as both threats and instruments, exploiting fear and vengeance to maintain control in a city already teetering on the brink. Orders were communicated, documented, and enforced with a chilling precision, leaving ordinary people caught in a deadly web from which there was often no escape. The combination of bureaucratic rigor, ideological justification, and field-level discretion created a climate in which executions were both systematic and unpredictable, a paradoxical mixture that underscored the extremity of Berlin's final days. By examining these orders and their implementation, it becomes clear that the lethal environment was not a product of spontaneous violence alone, but the result of deliberate policies grounded in ideology, fear, and tactical necessity. Understanding this duality, how formal directives intersected with human interpretation and the pressures of survival, provides crucial insight into the broader narrative of Berlin's collapse, illuminating why ordinary civilians became targets in a war that had long since outgrown conventional boundaries. Through the lens of documents, memos, and eyewitness accounts, the city emerges not simply as a battlefield, but as a stage where human decisions, systemic brutality, and ideological fervor converged with lethal consequences. In the shattered streets of Berlin, the ultimate enforcers of the city's deadly orders were not faceless bureaucrats issuing directives from distant command posts, but individual soldiers confronting a world that had been reduced to chaos, fear, and vengeance. The psychology of these men, particularly the Soviet troops pressing relentlessly into the city, provides crucial insight into the human machinery behind indiscriminate violence. To understand the dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight, one must examine the complex interplay of fear, trauma, ideology, and retribution that shaped soldiers' behavior, transforming ordinary human beings into agents capable of executing extreme acts under the pressures of war. The advancing Red Army entered Berlin not merely as a military force, but as a collective manifestation of decades of personal and national trauma. Soldiers carried memories of villages burned, families slaughtered, and entire communities decimated during the German invasion of the Soviet Union. These experiences were not abstract. They were deeply personal wounds, reinforced by state propaganda and long-standing narratives of ideological struggle. Reports and diaries from the front lines reveal how soldiers internalized the stories of atrocity, creating a psychological landscape in which vengeance became not only justified but demanded. Civilians in Berlin were perceived, in some ways, as extensions of the regime that had inflicted suffering upon Soviet lands, a human embodiment of past horrors that could, in the minds of soldiers, be punished without moral hesitation. The cognitive framing of the enemy, cultivated over years of indoctrination and first-hand trauma, allowed soldiers to bypass normal ethical restraints, transforming acts of extreme violence into perceived moral obligations. Fear operated alongside vengeance as a critical driver of behavior. Urban combat in Berlin was chaotic and unpredictable, with ambushes, sniper fire, and improvised explosives creating a constant sense of threat. Soldiers were acutely aware that the enemy could strike from any direction, including from within the civilian population. This uncertainty fostered hypervigilance, a state in which suspicion became a default mode of operation. Field reports and survivor testimonies frequently describe soldiers reacting to minor disturbances, movement in a doorway, a cry from a cellar, as potential signs of sabotage or collaboration. Fear, both rational and amplified by previous trauma, lowered the threshold for lethal action, making the enforcement of shoot-on-sight policies both psychologically sustainable and practically necessary in the soldier's eyes. In such an environment, hesitation could mean death, while proactive aggression became a defensive mechanism as much as a tool of control. Indoctrination played a complementary role, reinforcing both vengeance and fear. Soviet troops had been exposed to years of ideological education emphasizing the existential struggle against fascism, portraying the war as a moral and historical imperative. Posters, speeches, and propaganda films depicted Germans not merely as soldiers, but as part of a morally corrupt and inherently violent system, which legitimized retaliation and preemptive punishment. While the brutality of urban combat and the personal traumas of soldiers primed them for violence, ideological conditioning provided a moral framework that allowed them to reconcile acts that would ordinarily contravene conscience. Within this context, executing civilians could be interpreted not as murder but as justice, retribution, or the necessary fulfillment of duty, a cognitive restructuring that permitted extreme acts without the paralyzing weight of guilt for many. Trauma further complicated the psychological calculus. Soldiers entering Berlin were often exhausted, malnourished, and psychologically frayed by years of relentless warfare. Exposure to prolonged combat can induce hyperarousal, emotional numbing, and heightened aggression, all of which increase the likelihood of violent responses in ambiguous situations. Diaries from the period indicate that many soldiers experienced intrusive memories of past losses, nightmares, and pervasive anxiety, yet were unable to articulate these experiences in a supportive environment, leaving aggression as the primary outlet for psychological strain. The intensity of combat, combined with the unresolved trauma of prior atrocities and the anticipatory stress of urban engagement, created conditions under which extreme violence became both psychologically understandable and operationally expedient. In this way, ordinary individuals, placed under extraordinary conditions, could commit acts that would have been inconceivable in peacetime. The social dynamics within military units amplified these tendencies. Soldiers were embedded in hierarchies where obedience, reputation, and peer pressure exerted powerful influences. Reports from Berlin reveal that junior officers frequently encouraged preemptive action, framing hesitation as weakness and initiative in violence as courage or competence. In crowded, chaotic urban environments, soldiers often relied on collective behavior cues, executing actions because they were normalized within their immediate social group. Fear of reprisal from commanding officers or ostracism from peers further diminished moral restraint, ensuring that once violence was institutionalized, it could propagate quickly and ruthlessly. This dynamic, combined with the personal and collective psychological pressures, created a feedback loop. Soldiers acted violently to survive and comply, which normalized further violence, which in turn reinforced the necessity of obedience. Revenge was not merely abstract, but enacted through the perception of moral debt. Soldiers carried a deep awareness of the suffering inflicted on their families, communities, and nation. Eyewitness accounts describe how even fleeting moments, catching a civilian scavenging, encountering a young man outside his home, could trigger a disproportionate response rooted in a desire for payback. This desire was compounded by the official policies and directives that encouraged harsh treatment of civilians, ensuring that personal vendetta aligned with operational objectives. The convergence of personal vengeance and sanctioned violence produced a psychological environment in which civilians became convenient vessels for collective anger. Ordinary decisions, whether to investigate a cellar, secure a street corner, or enforce curfew, were charged with both practical and emotional intensity, transforming routine military duties into lethal encounters. Psychological studies conducted post-war offer insight into the mechanisms that enabled soldiers to carry out atrocities while maintaining functional self-perception. Concepts such as dehumanization, moral disengagement, and diffusion of responsibility are particularly relevant. Civilians in Berlin were framed as complicit or dangerous by official narratives, a process that stripped them of individualized moral consideration. Soldiers could rationalize that they were acting on orders or executing justice, not targeting innocents. Additionally, the chaotic, decentralized environment meant that responsibility was distributed across a network of individuals and commands, diffusing personal accountability and reducing the psychological barriers to violence. This convergence of cognitive, emotional, and social mechanisms explains why men and women, often ordinary in every other context, could participate in, condone, or carry out lethal measures against fellow human beings without immediate psychological collapse. The interaction of ideology, fear, and trauma manifested not only in isolated incidents but in systematic behavior. Units assigned to specific sectors were briefed repeatedly on the risks posed by civilians and instructed to act decisively against suspected collaborators. Soldiers internalized these instructions within the framework of survival, revenge, and duty, reinforcing behaviors that were both operationally expedient and psychologically validated. Testimonies indicate that some soldiers expressed internal conflict, yet even awareness of moral transgression did not preclude action. The combined pressures of command, peer conformity, and personal history created a coercive psychological ecosystem. Within this environment, executions on site were normalized, routinized, and, paradoxically, morally justified in the soldiers' own minds. Importantly, this psychological framework was not unique to Soviet troops. While the context of the Eastern Front, personal trauma, and ideological indoctrination shaped their actions, similar mechanisms operated among German forces enforcing their own shoot-on-sight orders. Fear, obedience, peer pressure, and moral disengagement are universally applicable in conditions of extreme stress, particularly in wartime urban environments where civilian and combatant distinctions are blurred. The convergence of structural orders and human psychology demonstrates how systematic brutality is both a product of policy and of the conditions that shape individuals' behavior in extraordinary circumstances. By examining these factors, one gains a clearer understanding of the forces that transformed ordinary soldiers into enforcers of lethal directives. The streets of Berlin in the spring of 1945 were theaters of sudden, unpredictable violence, where civilians navigated a landscape in which survival often depended on a mixture of luck, instinct, and the capacity to remain unseen. For many, the night brought not rest but terror, as the echoes of artillery merged with the footsteps of patrolling soldiers and the distant cries of those caught in the deadly enforcement of shoot-on-sight policies. To understand the dark reasons civilians in Berlin were shot on sight, it is essential to move beyond the abstract frameworks of military orders and psychology, and into the intimate, harrowing experiences of those who lived through the city's final days. Through survivor testimonies, family accounts, and eyewitness reports, the randomness, fear, and brutality of this period emerge with acute clarity, transforming statistics into deeply human narratives. One survivor, an elderly woman named Marta K., recalled the moment when a Soviet patrol entered her neighborhood. She had been tending to her garden, trying to salvage what little vegetables had survived the spring frost, when soldiers burst into the yard, shouting in rapid Russian. Fear surged through her, paralyzing both thought and motion. She had done nothing to provoke them, yet proximity alone was enough to make her a potential target. The soldiers, operating under the belief that civilians could be collaborators or informants, interrogated her briefly, their eyes scanning for any perceived sign of resistance. Marta remembered holding her breath, convinced that the slightest movement could be fatal. Her survival depended on stillness, humility, and the unpredictable judgment of soldiers whose own fear and trauma magnified their perception of threat. Across Berlin, similar encounters unfolded constantly, ordinary people caught in the intersection of strict enforcement, suspicion, and sheer misfortune. The randomness of survival extended to children, who were often entirely helpless in the face of arbitrary violence. Accounts from families describe instances in which young boys carrying small tools or food to aid their families were mistaken for combatants and shot, while children in basements or cellars escaped unscathed simply because the patrol did not notice them. These moments under a cruel reality, proximity, timing, and perception dictated life and death far more than action or intent. One father, recounting the loss of his teenage son, described how his boy had stepped outside to retrieve a bucket of water when a Soviet soldier, startled by the sudden movement, fired without warning. The boy's death was instantaneous, a reminder that ordinary routines became deadly gambles under the distorted lens of fear and enforcement. Women were equally vulnerable. Eyewitness reports indicate that women attempting to gather supplies, care for wounded relatives, or even seek shelter were sometimes treated as suspicious, their movements misinterpreted as acts of defiance or collaboration. Survivors describe scenes in which women were interrogated on the street, forced to comply with arbitrary commands, or executed without formal accusation. In one account, a woman named Irmgard L. was shot while attempting to bring her sick child to a makeshift hospital. Soldiers, influenced by prior trauma and indoctrination, perceived her urgency as a potential threat, illustrating how fear distorted perception and allowed tragedy to proliferate. These stories reveal not only the arbitrariness of violence, but also the profound social and emotional disruption inflicted on families, communities, and neighborhoods. Neighborhoods themselves became spaces of tension and vulnerability. Streets, stairwells, and alleys that had once facilitated daily life were transformed into traps. Civilians moving from one building to another for food, medicine, or safety risked encountering patrolling soldiers at any moment. Even those who attempted to remain indoors were not entirely safe. The intensity of urban combat meant that stray bullets, artillery fragments, or misidentified figures could claim lives indiscriminately. Survivor testimonies frequently mention the constant calculation required to navigate such spaces, balancing the need for sustenance with the imperative of invisibility. Families developed unspoken rules to minimize exposure, such as sending only one person at a time to scavenge, limiting movements during daylight hours, or employing signaling systems to indicate safe passages. These adaptations were fraught with anxiety and risk, emphasizing how survival depended not only on circumstance but on keen observation and disciplined restraint. Misidentification was a pervasive cause of death. Soldiers operating under fear, stress, and ideological conviction often interpreted normal civilian behavior as hostile. In one documented instance, a man collecting firewood outside his apartment was assumed to be preparing explosives and was shot immediately. Another survivor recounted how a group of children playing near a ruined school was mistaken for a scouting party and fired upon. The pervasive uncertainty in identifying friend, foe, or innocent bystander meant that civilians were frequently punished for actions that were entirely benign. This randomness intensified the psychological toll on the population, creating an environment in which fear and hesitation were constant companions, and the consequences of even the most mundane decisions could be fatal. The emotional impact of these events was compounded by the suddenness and brutality of execution. Witnesses described soldiers acting with rapid, almost mechanical efficiency, leaving no opportunity for appeal or explanation. Families were left to grapple with the immediate absence of loved ones, often unable to recover bodies or confirm deaths. This created a dual layer of trauma: the direct loss of life and the prolonged anguish of uncertainty, grief, and helplessness. In many cases, entire families were affected simultaneously, as one fatal encounter could claim multiple members. Survivor narratives consistently emphasize the overwhelming sense of powerlessness, as ordinary people were forced to navigate a lethal environment dictated by fear-driven interpretations of military orders. Despite the omnipresent danger, acts of ingenuity and courage also emerged. Some civilians managed to survive through quick thinking, alliances with neighbors, or exploiting moments of confusion among soldiers. A young woman named Helene B. recounted how she shielded her younger siblings by convincing soldiers that they were lost children separated from their parents, using tears, pleading, and familiarity with Russian phrases to secure temporary mercy. Others hid for days in basements, attics, or ruins, rationing what little food they had and relying on signals from sympathetic neighbors to avoid detection. These acts, though courageous, were often fragile, depending on precise timing, chance encounters, and the unpredictable temperament of armed personnel. The tension between agency and helplessness illustrates the razor-thin margin between survival and death in a city where the consequences of minor actions were magnified exponentially. Communal experiences of terror also highlight the broader social consequences of shoot-on-sight policies. Neighbors distrusted each other, wary that any individual could inadvertently provoke lethal attention. Some reports describe families concealing relatives who were suspected of minor offenses or collaborating with soldiers to reduce risk, while others were compelled to abandon homes entirely to escape scrutiny. This social fragmentation not only intensified isolation but amplified fear, creating an ecosystem in which civilians became both vulnerable and complicit, their behavior constantly mediated by the anticipation of external violence. The city's social fabric, already strained by wartime scarcity, hunger, and dislocation, frayed further under the psychological pressure of constant lethal threat. Eyewitness accounts also reveal the indiscriminate nature of enforcement. Civilians were shot while fleeing buildings under artillery fire, while attempting to gather essential supplies, or simply walking through their neighborhoods. These instances understood that survival was contingent on a combination of compliance, discretion, and fortuitous circumstance. In one detailed report, a man who had been a respected member of his community was executed after being misidentified as a partisan. The soldier who fired later expressed confusion, highlighting the arbitrary, fear-driven logic that governed life and death in the city. These events transformed the perception of daily existence. Routines that had once been mundane became perilous, and the very act of movement carried existential risk. The cumulative effect of such encounters was profound, shaping post-war memories, family narratives, and historical documentation. Survivors carried the psychological imprint of constant fear, grief, and the awareness of life's fragility under systemic violence. Testimonies highlight both the randomness of survival and the enduring trauma experienced by those who lived through the city's collapse. Each story, while unique in circumstance, converges on common themes: the unpredictability of violence, the suffocating weight of fear, and the desperate measures civilians employed to preserve life. Through these human experiences, the broader historical reality of shoot-on-sight enforcement becomes tangible, illustrating not only the scale of brutality but its intimate, personal consequences. The narratives of families also emphasize generational impact. Children who survived often did so at great cost, witnessing the deaths of siblings, parents, and neighbors. The psychological scars of such experiences influenced post-war behavior, social relations, and collective memory. Elderly survivors reflected on how the city's collapse had rendered them helpless, transforming familiar streets into arenas of constant threat. Communities that had once been cohesive were shattered, and the trauma of arbitrary execution left deep emotional fissures. Through these testimonies, the human cost of military and ideological decisions becomes not a statistic but a lived reality, a stark demonstration of how policy, fear, and chance intersected to shape the fate of civilians. In the final days of Berlin, the orchestration of violence was inseparable from the machinery of perception. Civilians were not merely caught in crossfire. Their lives were shaped by a sustained campaign of messaging that framed them as potential enemies, collaborators, or morally suspect actors. The dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight cannot be fully understood without examining how propaganda, in its many forms, cultivated fear, justified punishment, and normalized lethal enforcement. For both the German and Soviet forces, shaping perception was as crucial as issuing orders, as it allowed soldiers and officers to reconcile extreme actions with a sense of moral or ideological legitimacy. Propaganda, in essence, created the cognitive scaffolding that made indiscriminate violence comprehensible, necessary, and even righteous within the wartime context. The role of propaganda in Berlin was multifaceted, targeting both the civilian population and the military enforcers. For the Germans, years of indoctrination had cultivated a worldview in which loyalty and obedience were paramount, and deviation equated to betrayal. Posters, pamphlets, and radio broadcasts depicted enemies and traitors in starkly dehumanizing terms, emphasizing the moral and physical dangers posed by those who opposed or questioned the regime. By portraying civilians as either potential informants or accomplices to advancing forces, the messaging constructed a mental framework in which suspicion was normalized and preemptive action against civilians could be rationalized. Even as the city crumbled, such propaganda remained pervasive, reinforcing a culture in which fear and ideological conformity intertwined, leaving civilians vulnerable to lethal enforcement measures justified under the rubric of duty. The Soviet approach was similarly systematic, though rooted in a different set of historical and ideological imperatives. Soldiers were inundated with narratives emphasizing revenge and justice, portraying German civilians collectively as bearers of culpability for the devastation wrought upon Soviet lands. Posters and pamphlets depicted the German populace as an extension of the Nazi war machine, implicating ordinary people in atrocities that they had often not personally committed. Military briefings reinforced this perspective, framing civilians not as neutral observers but as potential adversaries whose compliance, or failure to comply, carried life-and-death consequences. By linking perception to action, Soviet propaganda ensured that soldiers internalized the idea that lethal enforcement was both warranted and morally defensible. In this way, media, messaging, and official communications operated in tandem to create a conceptual environment in which indiscriminate violence became both predictable and psychologically sustainable. The mechanisms of propaganda were subtle yet pervasive, functioning on multiple levels to shape cognitive and emotional responses. Visual materials such as posters employed stark imagery and hyperbolic depictions of threat, instilling a constant sense of danger in both the civilian population and the soldiers enforcing policy. For example, German propaganda often depicted infiltrators or saboteurs as monstrous figures, their humanity stripped away to facilitate moral disengagement among troops. Similarly, Soviet imagery highlighted the suffering of occupied territories, portraying civilians under German control as victims and the German populace as morally compromised actors responsible for oppression. By amplifying threat perception and reinforcing ideological narratives, these visual cues conditioned soldiers to view civilians not as innocents but as extensions of the enemy, legitimizing preemptive violence in their minds. Language and narrative framing also played a critical role. Broadcasts, written instructions, and field briefings used moralistic and absolutist terminology to construct binaries of loyalty versus betrayal, innocence versus culpability. Civilians were often described as collaborators or potential threats, and compliance was framed as a moral imperative. In a cognitive sense, this constant repetition facilitated moral disengagement, allowing soldiers to reconcile lethal action with the notion of justice. Historical studies of wartime propaganda demonstrate that such framing effectively primes individuals to accept violence against groups identified as enemies, even in the absence of direct personal threat. In Berlin, the repetition of these narratives across multiple channels created a self-reinforcing perception that civilians were not merely at risk but actively culpable, rendering shoot-on-sight policies psychologically justifiable within the military hierarchy. Propaganda also served a practical function in consolidating control over a population experiencing extreme stress and deprivation. By constructing civilians as potential threats, military authorities could rationalize measures that would otherwise provoke moral or ethical concern. For example, public executions or patrols enforcing shoot-on-sight orders were framed as necessary deterrents against collaboration or sabotage, reinforcing both obedience among the population and compliance among soldiers. Eyewitness testimonies from Berlin describe how the visibility of such measures, coupled with prior exposure to dehumanizing narratives, created a pervasive fear in which civilians internalized the threat and altered their behavior accordingly. Movement, communication, and daily routines were constantly mediated by the perceived expectations of armed personnel, illustrating how propaganda translated directly into behavioral control and heightened vulnerability to lethal enforcement. Historical parallels further illuminate the power of propaganda in enabling mass violence. From the Rwandan genocide to the systematic targeting of civilians in Eastern Europe, the dehumanization of populations through media, narrative, and visual representation has repeatedly facilitated extraordinary acts of brutality. In Berlin, this pattern manifested in both explicit and implicit messaging. Soldiers were not merely following orders. They were operating within a cognitive framework that had been shaped to normalize extreme action against civilians. The psychological interplay of fear, ideology, and messaging underscores a recurring historical principle: that mass violence often depends as much on perception and narrative construction as on operational imperatives. Propaganda, by framing civilians as enemies, created the cognitive conditions that allowed routine enforcement to merge seamlessly with moral rationalization, producing an environment in which ordinary people became targets without explicit individual justification. The dissemination of propaganda was carefully coordinated to reinforce existing narratives and maximize psychological impact. Military briefings combined operational instructions with ideological reinforcement, ensuring that soldiers understood both the tactical rationale and the moral framing for their actions. Field reports indicate that commanders emphasized the importance of perceiving civilians as potential threats, instructing soldiers to act decisively and without hesitation. Newspapers, leaflets, and radio broadcasts amplified these messages, reaching both urban and rural populations and creating a culture of fear that extended beyond immediate combat zones. In Berlin, the cumulative effect was a city in which perception and reality were intertwined. Civilians internalized the narrative of threat, soldiers enforced orders under its influence, and the boundaries between action, justification, and morality became increasingly porous. Propaganda's influence extended beyond immediate perception to shape long-term social and psychological dynamics. Survivors reported how repeated exposure to messaging depicting civilians as culpable or dangerous heightened anxiety, altered social interactions, and contributed to pervasive mistrust within communities. Families developed strategies to avoid suspicion, neighbors withheld information about one another's movements, and children were socialized into hypervigilance as a survival mechanism. This social adaptation, while protective, also illustrates the insidious reach of propaganda. It not only justified violence in the moment but reshaped behavior, cognition, and social norms in ways that perpetuated vulnerability and reinforced the logic of enforcement. Importantly, the role of propaganda in Berlin underscores the interplay between ideology and operational necessity. While shoot-on-sight policies were framed as tactical measures, their implementation relied on soldiers' internalization of narratives that dehumanized civilians and normalized violence. Historical documentation demonstrates that without such cognitive framing, many soldiers would likely have resisted or hesitated in carrying out lethal enforcement, highlighting the integral role of perception in the orchestration of mass violence. The convergence of messaging, indoctrination, and operational pressure created conditions in which ordinary individuals could act in extraordinary ways, transforming policy into lived, brutal reality on the city streets. The enforcement of shoot-on-sight orders in Berlin during the final days of World War II was not a series of haphazard acts, but a carefully orchestrated system of operational procedures designed to maximize both fear and efficiency. Civilians did not merely suffer from the chaos of urban warfare. They were deliberately caught within a framework that converted their very presence into potential criminality, a structure in which survival often depended on proximity, timing, and compliance with arbitrary rules. The dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight becomes starkly apparent when the mechanics of enforcement are examined. Checkpoints, street patrols, curfews, and random executions operated in concert to create an environment in which ordinary life was impossible, and death could come without warning. At the heart of this operational framework were the checkpoints established throughout the city. Major intersections, bridges, and strategic thoroughfares were manned by soldiers tasked with monitoring movement, verifying identities, and intercepting any perceived threats. Archival reports from Soviet and German units alike indicate that these checkpoints served dual purposes: controlling civilian movement and creating a psychological presence that enforced compliance through fear. Civilians attempting to pass were subject to scrutiny that was often arbitrary, with minor infractions such as carrying tools, rationed goods, or even loitering near a strategic site triggering suspicion. The act of stopping and checking individuals reinforced a constant sense of surveillance, while the potential for immediate lethal consequences ensured that compliance was perceived not merely as advisable but as essential to survival. For many Berliners, even the familiar streets became psychologically fraught, each checkpoint a potential site of mortality rather than protection. Street patrols complemented the static enforcement provided by checkpoints. Soldiers moved through neighborhoods, scanning buildings, courtyards, and alleyways for signs of resistance or collaboration. Patrols were often structured in pairs or small units, combining mobility with the ability to respond quickly to perceived threats. Survivor accounts repeatedly describe the terror inspired by these patrols. The sound of boots echoing on cracked pavement could signal impending violence, prompting families to hide in basements or rubble-strewn attics for hours at a time. The unpredictability of encounters made each movement potentially fatal, and the constant presence of patrolling soldiers amplified the sense that the city itself had become an omnipresent, lethal authority. Operationally, these patrols were designed to cover as much ground as possible, ensuring that civilians could rarely move without risk while maintaining the broader objective of controlling the population through fear. Curfews were another critical component of enforcement. Both German and Soviet commands imposed strict time restrictions on civilian movement, often without clear communication or consistent enforcement. Violations were interpreted as deliberate acts of defiance or potential collaboration, providing soldiers with justification for immediate, lethal intervention. The curfew system also had a practical function. By concentrating civilians within homes during designated hours, authorities could more effectively monitor neighborhoods, reducing the opportunity for organized resistance and simplifying the identification of perceived offenders. However, curfews also created significant humanitarian challenges. Civilians who needed to procure food, water, or medical assistance often had to risk exposure, knowing that deviation from the prescribed hours could result in instant execution. Survivor testimonies reveal how families devised elaborate schedules to navigate curfew constraints, sending only one member at a time into the streets, rationing movements, and developing signaling systems to warn each other of approaching patrols. Random executions were perhaps the most terrifying and visible element of the shoot-on-sight enforcement system. In strategic locations, soldiers were instructed to act decisively against any civilian deemed suspicious or non-compliant. Execution procedures were often formalized, with soldiers given sectors to monitor and explicit instructions to eliminate targets who failed to respond to commands or appeared near restricted areas. The randomness of these acts, combined with their public nature, magnified their psychological impact. Witnesses frequently reported seeing neighbors, family members, or strangers shot in open courtyards or along main streets, their deaths serving as immediate warnings to the surrounding population. The operational logic was clear. By making examples of civilians, soldiers reinforced the perception of omnipresent authority, ensuring that the fear generated by executions extended beyond the immediate victims to shape broader behavioral compliance. Logistical planning underpinned these methods. Military units coordinated movement patterns, patrol schedules, and checkpoint assignments to maximize coverage while minimizing redundancy. Orders emphasized efficiency, instructing soldiers to maintain vigilance, act decisively, and document perceived infractions. Archival records indicate that higher command maintained oversight through reports and communication channels, with feedback loops reinforcing patterns of behavior observed at the ground level. For example, units were instructed to report instances of non-compliance or suspected collaboration, which then informed subsequent patrol routes and checkpoint priorities. This combination of centralized planning and decentralized execution created a system in which lethal enforcement could operate continuously, covering both predictable and unpredictable elements of civilian behavior. The city itself, in effect, became a grid of surveillance, enforcement, and potential execution, with ordinary citizens caught at the nodes of a highly organized operational network. The operational rationale behind these measures was twofold: tactical and psychological. Tactically, soldiers sought to prevent sabotage, resistance, or intelligence gathering by civilians who might inadvertently or intentionally aid opposing forces. By establishing a pervasive and unpredictable enforcement network, military authorities aimed to reduce threats and maintain control even amidst widespread urban destruction. Psychologically, the same system was designed to instill terror, ensuring that compliance was internalized and that the population refrained from testing boundaries. The dual objectives of efficiency and intimidation created a self-reinforcing environment. Civilians adjusted behavior to avoid death, patrols observed and documented compliance, and the fear of exposure further justified the maintenance of lethal operational routines. Operational methods were also adapted to the urban topography of Berlin. Narrow streets, multi-story apartment buildings, and underground tunnels presented both challenges and opportunities for soldiers. Patrols had to navigate debris, shell-damaged infrastructure, and collapsed buildings while maintaining visibility and control. Soldiers were trained to anticipate civilian movement through common routes, assess potential ambush points, and establish vantage points for monitoring activity. Checkpoints were strategically placed at choke points, bridges, and key intersections, ensuring that even fleeting movement could be observed and, if necessary, punished. In multi-story apartment blocks, stairwells, attics, and basements were regularly inspected, sometimes resulting in mass detentions or executions of anyone deemed suspicious. This adaptation to physical space illustrates the operational sophistication behind seemingly arbitrary acts of violence. The city's very layout was integrated into the enforcement machinery, making it both a battlefield and a cage. The role of communication and intelligence was critical in coordinating these operations. Units were connected through field radios, runners, and dispatches, allowing commanders to direct patrols, adjust checkpoint priorities, and respond to perceived threats in real time. Intelligence was derived from reports, civilian informants, and observational assessments, all contributing to a continually updated operational map of perceived danger. This system ensured that even random enforcement actions were informed by broader strategic considerations. Soldiers could act swiftly while maintaining alignment with higher-level objectives. The integration of communication, intelligence, and mobility created a dynamic system in which lethal enforcement could be both spontaneous and methodical, producing an environment in which civilians were almost always at risk, regardless of intent or behavior. The psychological impact of these operational mechanics on civilians cannot be overstated. The visibility of patrols, checkpoints, and executions reinforced a sense of omnipresent authority, while the unpredictability of encounters ensured that no one could feel truly safe. Families altered their daily routines, limited travel, and took extraordinary measures to conceal themselves from soldiers whose decisions were influenced as much by fear, indoctrination, and situational judgment as by formal orders. The operational efficiency of the enforcement system was amplified by the constant tension it created, ensuring that fear remained a tool as powerful as any physical barrier or weapon. Civilians became conditioned to assume the worst, anticipating lethal consequences at every turn, and adapting behavior in ways that reflected both survival instinct and psychological coercion. Importantly, the mechanics of enforcement highlight the interplay between policy and human behavior. Soldiers were instructed to act decisively, yet the decentralized nature of urban operations meant that individual judgment played a critical role in the application of lethal measures. The combination of strict orders, environmental unpredictability, and the personal interpretation of risk created a feedback loop in which operational rules, fear, and improvisation reinforced one another. Random executions, checkpoints, patrols, and curfews were not isolated phenomena. They formed an integrated system in which fear, efficiency, and obedience were mutually reinforcing. Civilians, for their part, became active participants in the system's logic, constantly adjusting behavior to avoid death, yet never able to fully control the lethal mechanisms surrounding them. As Berlin streets descended further into chaos, civilians found themselves navigating not only the lethal presence of soldiers, but also the moral and social complexities of survival under extreme stress. The dark reasons civilians in Berlin were shot on sight intersects with these choices, revealing how ordinary people became actors in a perilous moral landscape where resistance, collaboration, and complicity were often indistinguishable. In a city teetering on the edge of annihilation, survival required a constant negotiation between self-preservation, fear, and ethical considerations, producing a spectrum of behaviors that reflected both ingenuity and desperation. Resistance manifested in both overt and subtle forms. Some Berliners attempted to subvert military authority, provide intelligence to opposing forces, or engage in acts of sabotage against occupying troops. These acts, while courageous, carried enormous risk. Capture often meant summary execution or immediate retaliation against neighbors and family members. For example, underground networks continued to operate in the rubble of the city, distributing anti-fascist leaflets or assisting those fleeing the city. Participation in such networks required calculated discretion, blending courage with cunning, as any misstep could provoke violent consequences. The acts of resistance, though limited in scope due to the city's devastation, reveal that civilians were not uniformly passive victims, but rather engaged in strategic, morally driven choices to assert agency in a context dominated by coercion. Collaboration, in contrast, was often driven by the necessity of survival rather than ideological alignment. Individuals and families found themselves negotiating with soldiers, providing information, performing labor, or complying with arbitrary demands to avoid lethal repercussions. Collaboration was rarely a matter of loyalty but of pragmatism. Civilians quickly learned that compliance could offer temporary protection, access to scarce resources, or a reprieve from immediate danger. Eyewitness accounts detail instances in which neighbors acted as intermediaries, translating orders, signaling approaching patrols, or providing access to food and shelter. While collaboration often carried a moral stigma in post-war narratives, in the context of Berlin's destruction, such actions were frequently essential to preserve life and mitigate risk. Complicity existed in the gray zones between resistance and collaboration. Civilians could find themselves passively complicit simply by failing to act, remaining silent about suspicious activities, or observing executions without intervention. The omnipresence of patrols, checkpoints, and curfews created conditions in which passivity itself was a form of enforced compliance, often motivated by fear rather than intent. Families instructed children to avoid interaction with soldiers, neighbors refrained from questioning actions for fear of reprisal, and entire communities adapted behaviors that minimized exposure. In this sense, complicity was not always voluntary. It was a survival mechanism shaped by coercion, observation, and the stark calculus of risk and mortality. The social dynamics of resistance, collaboration, and complicity were further complicated by local informants. Soldiers often relied on civilian intermediaries to identify suspected collaborators or to monitor behavior within neighborhoods. In some cases, informants acted out of ideological alignment. In others, personal grievances, opportunism, or coercion shaped their actions. Testimonies reveal that even small disputes or long-standing rivalries could become lethal when framed as suspicion of disloyalty or subversion. The presence of informants magnified the climate of fear and uncertainty, reinforcing the lethal operational environment and ensuring that civilians were constantly negotiating trust, secrecy, and exposure. This created a social ecosystem in which individuals had to make rapid decisions, balancing ethical considerations against the very real threat of death. Moral dilemmas were omnipresent in Berlin's collapsed society. Families had to decide whether to conceal individuals suspected of minor offenses or collaboration, knowing that discovery could lead to immediate execution. Civilians weighing the choice to assist neighbors faced the same calculus. Help could save a life, but also attract lethal scrutiny. The ethical tensions of daily life were intensified by scarcity, displacement, and the unpredictability of military enforcement. Diaries and memoirs from the period reveal the psychological toll of these decisions. Guilt, fear, and rationalization intertwined as survival strategies were weighed against perceived moral obligations. For many, the line between right and necessary action blurred, creating a moral landscape defined by compromise, improvisation, and often regret. Children and adolescents were particularly affected by the spectrum of resistance and complicity. Witnessing adult choices, whether to resist, collaborate, or remain passive, shaped their understanding of morality and survival. Some children were enlisted in minor supportive tasks, such as delivering messages, scavenging for supplies, or alerting families to the presence of patrols. While these actions were often framed as necessary for family survival, they exposed young people to ethical ambiguity and physical danger. The participation of children underscores how extreme circumstances permeated all levels of society, eroding traditional moral structures and forcing individuals into roles dictated by immediate survival rather than conscious ethical deliberation. The interplay between operational enforcement and civilian behavior also created feedback loops in which resistance, collaboration, and complicity influenced each other. Acts of resistance could provoke harsher enforcement measures, while compliance could be misinterpreted as active collaboration, increasing suspicion and risk for neighbors. Conversely, collaboration by some civilians often provided temporary protection for communities, mitigating immediate lethal enforcement while establishing patterns of dependence and negotiation with occupying forces. The constant adaptation required by civilians illustrates the fluidity of social roles under extreme stress, highlighting that decisions were rarely fixed but responsive to evolving threats and opportunities. In this environment, the moral categories of victim, collaborator, and resistor were not static but interdependent, shaped by circumstance, risk, and strategic calculation. Eyewitness accounts reveal that the pressure of survival often blurred the distinction between voluntary and coerced actions. For instance, individuals who provided intelligence to soldiers under duress might later be labeled as collaborators, despite acting primarily to protect themselves or their families. In some neighborhoods, entire communities tacitly complied with patrol demands to prevent mass reprisals, creating a collective complicity that was as much a protective strategy as a moral choice. The ambiguity of these interactions emphasizes that human behavior under extreme stress cannot be easily categorized. Survival required negotiation, compromise, and rapid adaptation to circumstances that were unpredictable and lethal. Historical examples beyond Berlin demonstrate that these dynamics are neither unique nor exceptional. From occupied France to Eastern Europe, civilians under threat of military enforcement frequently navigated the same spectrum of resistance, collaboration, and complicity. The patterns observed in Berlin, moral compromise, negotiation with authorities, and the interplay of fear and survival, reflect broader principles of human behavior under extreme coercion. What makes Berlin distinctive is the intensity and immediacy of the threat, combined with the operational mechanisms of shoot-on-sight orders, which magnified the consequences of every decision and rendered the ethical landscape extraordinarily complex. The consequences of these dynamics extended beyond the immediate period of occupation. Post-war narratives frequently grappled with questions of guilt, responsibility, and memory, as families and communities reflected on choices made under duress. Survivors wrestled with the recognition that moral compromise had been a necessary component of survival, while communities debated the boundaries of culpability for those who had collaborated or failed to resist. These post-war reckonings reveal that the social and ethical impact of shoot-on-sight policies was not confined to the battlefield but persisted in shaping collective memory, social cohesion, and historical understanding. By examining resistance, collaboration, and complicity, it becomes evident that the dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight cannot be reduced to military orders or operational logistics alone. The human dimension, the choices, negotiations, and moral compromises of ordinary people, was integral to how lethal enforcement unfolded. Civilians were simultaneously victims, strategists, and actors, responding to a lethal environment with a combination of ingenuity, fear, and pragmatism. Their actions shaped both immediate survival outcomes and the broader social fabric, influencing patterns of enforcement, community cohesion, and historical memory. Understanding these dynamics is essential to grasping the full complexity of life under shoot-on-sight policies, highlighting the intersection of human agency, coercion, and moral ambiguity in extreme wartime conditions. As the devastation of Berlin became increasingly apparent, the international community struggled to comprehend the full scope of civilian suffering under the city's collapse. The dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight was initially filtered through wartime reporting, propagandistic lenses, and the limited perspectives available to foreign observers, leaving many to piece together narratives from fragmented information. Allied governments and media outlets grappled with documenting atrocities while simultaneously managing their own strategic objectives, creating a complex intersection of knowledge, interpretation, and public perception that shaped contemporary and subsequent understandings of civilian executions. During the war, reports of indiscriminate shootings and summary executions reached Allied audiences through official dispatches, refugee testimonies, and clandestine intelligence. However, the immediacy and reliability of this information were often compromised by the chaos of conflict, censorship, and the deliberate dissemination of selective narratives. Newspapers in London, Washington, and New York highlighted the broader collapse of Nazi Germany, while sometimes underreporting specific acts of civilian targeting, in part because verification was challenging, and in part because wartime priorities emphasized military developments over humanitarian documentation. Despite these limitations, accounts of mass shootings, particularly those associated with advancing Soviet forces, began to circulate, stirring concern among policymakers, journalists, and scholars, even as the full scale remained obscured by the fog of war. Media coverage was further complicated by the propagandistic use of information from all sides. Allied reporters often framed the city's collapse in terms of military triumph and retribution, occasionally minimizing the extent to which civilians were caught in crossfire or subjected to systematic enforcement measures. Conversely, Axis-aligned media emphasized chaos and victimization to foster fear and maintain ideological loyalty among the remaining populace. The resulting mix of narratives produced a distorted perception for the global audience. Berlin appeared simultaneously as a symbol of Nazi failure, a theater of military heroism, and a site of civilian tragedy. Within this context, the reality of shoot-on-sight policies remained partially obscured, leaving historians to reconstruct events from fragmentary evidence, eyewitness testimony, and archival records in the decades that followed. In the immediate post-war period, Allied authorities conducted investigations into the conduct of occupying forces, including the treatment of civilians in Berlin. War crimes tribunals, debriefings, and internal reports revealed the scope of killings, interrogating both the motivations behind shoot-on-sight orders and the operational methods by which they were executed. These inquiries illuminated the convergence of fear, ideology, and organizational structure that enabled mass executions, establishing a foundation for subsequent historical interpretation. While prosecutions often focused on high-ranking military and political figures, these investigations also highlighted the complexities of attributing responsibility to individuals operating under coercive orders, emphasizing the role of both systemic and situational factors in facilitating atrocities. Over time, scholarly debates emerged regarding the moral and operational dimensions of civilian targeting in Berlin. Historians examined the interplay between military necessity, psychological conditioning, and ideological indoctrination, seeking to understand why ordinary soldiers could carry out lethal enforcement with minimal resistance. Comparative studies highlighted similarities with other contexts of mass violence, demonstrating that civilians frequently occupy a morally ambiguous space under extreme duress, where survival, compliance, and coercion intersect. These analyses contributed to a nuanced understanding of Berlin's collapse, moving beyond sensationalist accounts to situate civilian executions within broader frameworks of operational logic, psychological influence, and the consequences of urban warfare. Media retrospectives and documentary projects further shaped public awareness and interpretation. Television broadcasts, memoirs, and historical reconstructions brought the experiences of civilians to global attention, humanizing statistical casualties through narrative detail and personal testimony. Interviews with survivors, soldiers, and journalists who witnessed the city's final days provided insight into the lived realities of shoot-on-sight enforcement, offering perspectives that challenged simplified notions of blame or causality. The synthesis of archival research, oral history, and visual documentation allowed audiences to grasp the complexity of events, illustrating how fear, policy, and circumstance intertwine to produce extraordinary levels of violence against civilians. The evolving historiography also addressed questions of accountability and systemic causation. Scholars debated the extent to which civilian targeting was a direct result of orders from high command versus an emergent property of urban warfare under extreme stress. Analyses revealed that operational procedures, ideological training, and the chaotic conditions of Berlin combined to produce an environment in which civilians were treated as de facto enemies. This perspective emphasized structural and contextual explanations, framing civilian executions not merely as isolated acts of individual malice, but as the predictable outcome of intersecting military, psychological, and societal pressures. In doing so, historical scholarship highlighted the complex ethical and analytical challenges inherent in understanding mass violence within densely populated urban settings. International reactions were also influenced by post-war geopolitical considerations. The emerging Cold War context shaped the framing of events in Berlin, with narratives of Soviet brutality often amplified as part of broader ideological contestation. Conversely, Soviet accounts emphasized the necessity of discipline and retribution, framing civilian executions as regrettable but unavoidable measures in the context of wartime devastation. This interplay of memory, political narrative, and historical documentation created multiple, sometimes conflicting interpretations, requiring subsequent historians to carefully disentangle evidence, bias, and narrative framing to reconstruct a credible account of civilian suffering. The challenge of navigating these competing perspectives underscored the difficulty of understanding the full scope of shoot-on-sight policies from an international standpoint. Historians also grappled with methodological questions regarding sources and reliability. Archival documents, field reports, and military correspondence provided invaluable insight into operational and strategic dimensions, while eyewitness testimony offered vivid, personal accounts of survival, fear, and loss. The juxtaposition of these sources allowed for cross-validation, revealing consistencies in patterns of enforcement, spatial distribution of executions, and the broader psychological environment of the city. Over time, these methods produced a richer, more multidimensional understanding of civilian targeting, situating individual stories within the broader context of military, social, and ideological dynamics. Contemporary scholarship continues to reassess Berlin's civilian experience through interdisciplinary approaches. Historians incorporate insights from psychology, sociology, and urban studies to examine how fear, authority, and environmental factors influenced behavior and decision-making. By situating civilian executions within these broader frameworks, modern analyses illuminate the interplay of policy, perception, and circumstance, revealing that the dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight was not simply an administrative directive, but the product of layered systemic, psychological, and social forces. This perspective challenges simplistic narratives and emphasizes the importance of integrating multiple analytical lenses to understand mass violence in urban warfare. The conclusion of hostilities in Berlin did not mark the end of suffering, nor did it provide immediate clarity regarding responsibility for the deaths of thousands of civilians caught in the shoot-on-sight enforcement. The dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight reverberated long after the city fell, leaving survivors, families, and historians to confront questions of justice, memory, and moral reckoning. Post-war efforts to document crimes, prosecute perpetrators, and commemorate victims unfolded unevenly, revealing the complex intersection of politics, memory, and historical accountability in both German and Soviet contexts. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied authorities undertook systematic investigations into the conduct of military forces, focusing on high-profile violations of international law, including the targeting of civilians. War crimes trials in Nuremberg and subsequent proceedings sought to establish accountability for those responsible for policies that enabled mass killings. While many prosecutions concentrated on German commanders and officials, evidence collected in these trials also illuminated the mechanisms through which civilians had been systematically endangered. Reports, testimonies, and field documents were meticulously examined to reconstruct operational procedures, identify the chain of command, and determine the degree of culpability of individuals who implemented or facilitated shoot-on-sight orders. These efforts were essential in creating a factual record of atrocities, laying the groundwork for historical scholarship and public understanding. Memorialization became a critical component of post-war reconciliation, as communities sought to honor victims while grappling with collective trauma. In Berlin, rubble-strewn neighborhoods and mass graves were transformed into sites of remembrance, with plaques, cemeteries, and museums documenting civilian experiences during the city's collapse. Survivors contributed personal narratives, photographs, and oral testimonies, ensuring that human stories accompanied statistical records. This process was not merely symbolic. It provided a framework for ethical reflection, allowing communities to acknowledge the scale of suffering, recognize acts of courage, and confront the moral ambiguities that characterized life under extreme threat. Memorialization thus served as both a historical record and a social mechanism for integrating collective grief into public consciousness. The struggle to reconcile these events within German and Soviet historical narratives was complex and politically charged. In Germany, discussions of civilian victimhood were often intertwined with broader debates about responsibility for Nazi atrocities, creating tensions between acknowledgement of suffering and the imperative to confront national culpability. Soviet historiography, in turn, emphasized the heroism of the Red Army and the narrative of liberation, frequently downplaying or justifying the lethal treatment of Berlin's civilians as a necessary wartime measure. These competing narratives complicated efforts to construct a shared understanding of events, illustrating how memory and justice are not only historical but deeply political processes. Historians working across these contexts face the challenge of disentangling ideology from fact, reconstructing events with integrity while acknowledging the biases embedded in contemporary and post-war sources. Documentation efforts were instrumental in shaping collective memory. Archival preservation of military reports, orders, and communications provided future generations with a foundation for analysis, allowing scholars to examine the operational logic and ideological frameworks that facilitated civilian targeting. Survivor testimonies offered complementary perspectives, capturing the human dimension of fear, loss, and resilience. The synthesis of these sources enabled a multidimensional understanding of Berlin's final days, highlighting both structural causation and individual experience. By integrating official documentation with personal narrative, historians were able to construct a comprehensive record, bridging the gap between abstract policy and lived reality. Justice, however, remained an uneven and often incomplete process. While some perpetrators faced prosecution and condemnation, others escaped accountability due to the complexities of post-war geopolitics, the sheer scale of urban destruction, and limitations in documentation. The passage of time further complicated efforts to attribute responsibility, as witnesses died, memories faded, and political priorities shifted. Nevertheless, even partial accountability contributed to a broader ethical reckoning, establishing legal and moral precedents for the treatment of civilians in wartime and reinforcing the principle that orders are not a defense for crimes against humanity. The pursuit of justice thus functioned both as a legal imperative and as a symbolic acknowledgement of human suffering. Collective memory of civilian targeting in Berlin evolved through generational reflection and historical inquiry. Memorial sites, museums, and educational programs facilitated engagement with the past, allowing subsequent generations to understand the context, mechanics, and consequences of shoot-on-sight policies. Literature, documentaries, and scholarly works amplified awareness, presenting narratives that emphasized both the individual experiences of victims and the systemic forces that shaped their fate. This ongoing process of remembrance reinforced the ethical lessons of the city's collapse, highlighting the dangers of dehumanization, ideological extremism, and the erosion of moral accountability under conditions of total war. Reconciliation efforts also extended into public discourse, where debates over commemoration, culpability, and interpretation reflected broader social tensions. Questions arose regarding the appropriate balance between remembering victimhood and acknowledging broader historical responsibility, as communities and nations sought to integrate these events into their national consciousness. In Germany, this involved negotiating the legacies of Nazi ideology and the moral weight of civilian suffering, while in the Soviet Union, it required reconciling narratives of liberation with documented excesses committed by occupying forces. These dialogues demonstrate that memory and justice are dynamic processes, shaped by evolving ethical standards, historical evidence, and social priorities, rather than fixed or universally agreed-upon interpretations. The integration of memory, justice, and historiography highlights the enduring significance of Berlin's civilian experience. By documenting crimes, honoring victims, and pursuing accountability, post-war societies constructed frameworks for understanding the consequences of extreme violence. These frameworks not only preserved historical facts but also provided ethical guidance for future conflicts, reinforcing the imperative that civilians must not be treated as collateral or targets of punitive policies. The dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight is thus preserved not only in records of atrocity, but also in the collective memory that informs moral and historical reflection. Finally, post-war reconciliation involved the human dimension of surviving communities, as individuals and families sought to rebuild lives amidst ruins and trauma. The act of remembering, recounting, and memorializing was in itself a form of survival, affirming humanity in the face of systemic violence. Survivors' accounts emphasize the tension between endurance and memory, illustrating that the legacy of shoot-on-sight policies extended beyond death to shape identity, social cohesion, and ethical consciousness. These efforts underscore the interdependence of memory and justice. Documenting and understanding atrocities becomes both a moral obligation and a foundation for social healing. Through this lens, the aftermath of Berlin's collapse is revealed as a complex interplay of accountability, remembrance, and reconciliation. Efforts to document crimes, prosecute perpetrators, and honor victims confronted the moral and political ambiguities inherent in civilian targeting. Memorialization and scholarship preserved individual experiences while contextualizing systemic causation, allowing societies to reflect on both human behavior and structural responsibility. The dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight thus remains a subject not only of historical record, but of enduring ethical and social engagement, demonstrating how memory and justice continue to shape our understanding of the human cost of war. The tragedy of Berlin in the final months of World War II offers sobering lessons about the vulnerability of civilians in urban warfare, the ethical obligations of military forces, and the human consequences of ideological and vengeful conflict. The dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight is not merely a historical footnote. It is a stark illustration of the conditions under which ordinary people become targets in the conflation of operational logic, psychological pressure, and political intent. Reflecting on these events provides insight into how contemporary military strategy, international law, and humanitarian policy can, and must, be informed by the experiences of those who lived under the threat of systematic, indiscriminate violence. One of the most immediate lessons is the necessity of clear ethical frameworks in wartime decision-making. Berlin's civilians were ensnared in a system in which operational expediency often overrode moral consideration, transforming streets, homes, and neighborhoods into spaces of lethal surveillance and enforcement. Soldiers, acting under explicit orders or interpreted mandates, carried out executions that blurred the distinction between combatant and non-combatant. In modern terms, this underscores the importance of military codes of conduct that prioritize the protection of civilians, emphasizing restraint, proportionality, and accountability. The experiences of Berlin demonstrate the catastrophic consequences when such ethical principles are subordinated to fear, ideology, or revenge, illustrating that civilian protection must be integral to strategic planning rather than an afterthought. The operational mechanisms that facilitated civilian targeting also highlight the vulnerabilities inherent in densely populated urban environments during armed conflict. Checkpoints, patrols, curfews, and random enforcement measures transformed the city into a controlled grid in which any civilian action could be interpreted as hostile. Contemporary conflicts often replicate similar dynamics. Urban combat, insurgency operations, and population control measures can inadvertently or deliberately place civilians at risk. Lessons from Berlin stress the importance of anticipating the human impact of operational decisions, including the spatial organization of urban combat, the deployment of armed forces, and the potential for misidentification or mistaken targeting. Protecting civilians requires understanding not only military objectives, but also the everyday behaviors and needs of those inhabiting conflict zones. Psychological and social dimensions further amplify civilian vulnerability. The fear, trauma, and coercive pressures observed in Berlin reveal that ordinary people may respond to extreme circumstances in ways that make them visible or invisible to military authorities, often regardless of intent. Families confined to basements, children tasked with minor errands, and neighbors compelled to negotiate survival strategies all navigated a system in which visibility could mean death. Modern military and humanitarian planning can draw from these observations by recognizing that civilian behavior in conflict is shaped by stress, scarcity, and the need to adapt to immediate threats. Policies and operational rules must account for these dynamics to mitigate harm, ensuring that civilians are not punished for natural, human responses to danger. Another critical lesson concerns the role of ideology and collective memory in perpetuating cycles of violence. In Berlin, centuries-old prejudices, wartime propaganda, and a desire for revenge converged to justify actions that would otherwise be morally unthinkable. The deliberate dehumanization of civilians facilitated their treatment as legitimate targets, and soldiers internalized these messages to rationalize behavior. Contemporary parallels are evident in conflicts where ethnic, religious, or political narratives are mobilized to legitimize civilian targeting. Understanding the Berlin case emphasizes the need for vigilance in countering propaganda, fostering ethical military culture, and promoting accountability for both individual and systemic violations. The erosion of moral constraints, once normalized, can have devastating consequences for civilian populations. Civilian narratives also provide essential insights into resilience and adaptation under extreme conditions. Survivors of Berlin developed strategies to navigate lethal enforcement, negotiate survival, and preserve social bonds amid pervasive fear. These strategies, while often morally ambiguous, demonstrate human ingenuity in the face of systemic threat. Recognizing the agency of civilians is crucial for contemporary humanitarian interventions, highlighting the importance of supporting local knowledge, community cohesion, and protective behaviors. Lessons from Berlin suggest that civilian protection efforts must be grounded not only in external regulations and military protocols, but also in the lived experiences and adaptive capacities of those at risk. The post-war pursuit of justice and memorialization further reinforces the lessons of Berlin. Documenting crimes, prosecuting perpetrators, and commemorating victims provide ethical, legal, and historical frameworks that extend beyond immediate wartime exigencies. Modern applications include the development of international humanitarian law, the establishment of war crimes tribunals, and the codification of rights and protections for non-combatants. Berlin illustrates that accountability and remembrance are not merely symbolic. They serve as preventive mechanisms, signaling to combatants and political leaders alike that violations against civilians carry consequences, and that historical memory preserves the ethical lessons of past atrocities. The convergence of operational, psychological, and ethical dimensions in Berlin also offers insight into the recurring patterns of violence against civilians. Across conflicts in the 20th and 21st centuries, from sieges to urban counterinsurgency operations, the themes of fear, systemic coercion, and ideological justification recur, highlighting the enduring relevance of Berlin's experience. Military strategists, policymakers, and humanitarian actors can draw lessons from these patterns to anticipate risks, implement protective measures, and evaluate the consequences of operational choices before civilian populations are imperiled. Awareness of historical precedent is a critical tool for both prevention and ethical reflection. Ultimately, the tragedy of Berlin challenges us to confront the human cost of ideological and vengeful warfare. Civilians were not collateral in an abstract military equation. They were human beings subjected to fear, coercion, and lethal enforcement. Recognizing this human dimension emphasizes the moral imperative to protect the most vulnerable, integrate ethical considerations into operational planning, and maintain vigilance against the dehumanization that enables mass violence. Lessons from Berlin underscore that safeguarding civilians is not only a legal obligation but a moral necessity, central to preserving the integrity of societies and the ethical conduct of war. Reflecting on Berlin also invites a broader philosophical and practical reckoning with the dynamics of war itself. The intersection of ideology, fear, and operational efficiency created conditions in which ordinary citizens were transformed into targets by systemic processes rather than individual malice alone. Understanding these dynamics helps modern military and civilian leaders recognize warning signs, design interventions, and implement protections to prevent similar tragedies. By integrating historical evidence with contemporary analysis, we gain tools to anticipate, mitigate, and ethically respond to the threats posed to civilians in conflict zones. Finally, the lessons of Berlin reinforce the continuity of historical inquiry as a tool for moral and practical guidance. Documenting experiences, analyzing systemic factors, and interpreting human responses in the context of extreme violence provide both ethical clarity and operational foresight. Civilians caught in the crossfire of ideology, retribution, and war-making remain central to understanding the consequences of armed conflict. The dark reason civilians in Berlin were shot on sight is preserved not merely as historical fact but as a cautionary guide, emphasizing the necessity of vigilance, ethical commitment, and proactive measures to safeguard human life in contemporary and future conflicts. In conclusion, Berlin's tragedy illustrates the vulnerabilities of civilians under extreme conditions, the ethical responsibilities of military forces, and the persistent human consequences of ideological warfare. By examining operational practices, psychological pressures, moral dilemmas, and post-war reflection, we gain a comprehensive understanding of how civilians become targets and how societies can respond to prevent recurrence. These lessons remain relevant today, reminding policymakers, military leaders, and global citizens alike that the protection of civilians is not incidental but fundamental to both human morality and the conduct of war.